everybody. Welcome and thank you all for coming. Tonight we have the Presbyterian minister Sheldon Jackson, portrayed by John Redmond. Minister Jackson supervised the building of churches in at least 22 Colorado locations. The South Park Community Church in Fairplay is one of those churches, and I'm sure many of you have been in Fairplay and seen this beautiful white church that's right there that's standing. John will talk about the history of Sheldon Jackson and his impact on Colorado and Alaska. So, I introduce to you Minister Sheldon Jackson.
Thank you, Karen. If you're not hearing me, let me know. Can everybody hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Karen. I really appreciate that, and I appreciate everyone coming tonight. And the placemats are wonderful, Jim. And it's just, they tell the whole story, and so I really didn't need to hear it. Sheldon Jackson was born in 1834, and I will try to give you a little bit of an idea of the dynamics of this man. Most of these stories start out by saying, I was born in a little cabin along a river, and as time progressed, I worked hard and became successful and became wealthy. Well, Sheldon Jackson, me being Sheldon Jackson, is almost the opposite situation. I started in 1834, born in Mineville, New York, to a wonderful, wonderful family. And the family was well thought of. The family was fairly well off, not wealthy, but very well off, very well connected with the political community, as well as the business community. And so this is the kind of family that I moved into, a wonderful family. When I was 4.5 years old, my parents said that Sheldon is going to become a preacher. And so all my life, I knew that I was going to become a preacher. And so I worked along those routes. There's a lot of other things that I couldn't do. Because growing up, I was very small for my age. I was ill a lot of the time. I had bad eyesight. So a lot of the things that the young men did in those days, a lot of the athletic activities, a lot of the fighting and all of that sort of stuff, I didn't get involved in because I was a little small and a little weak. But I grew up, and I grew all the way up to just over 5 foot tall. Sheldon Jackson, just over 5 foot tall. And I was ill a lot of the time, even growing up then. But I went through school, went through college, and then I graduated from Princeton Seminary in 1859, or 1858 actually. And you've seen the picture of the little white church there in Fairplay. The pastor of that church now also graduated from Princeton Seminary. He just did it about 150 years after I did. After graduation, I knew that I wanted to become a missionary. And just after graduation, I married a wonderful lady by the name of Mary Voorhees. And from there, we tried to get into the mission field. The mission group of the Presbyterian Church evaluated my situation and felt that I was too weak, I was too small, and I couldn't handle the rigors of going overseas to the mission field there. So they sent us to the Choctaw Indian Reservation in Arkansas. It was very difficult getting there. We finally got there, and once there, we found an awful lot of work to do. Mary was doing even more work than I was because the food didn't agree with me. I was more ill than I had been before. And also I got malaria. And so it did not work out well for me there at all. I was there only a few months and they sent me home. I was home just a short time, and they had a new field for me to go to. And that field was in the wilds of Minnesota. Now, I know we have at least one person from Minnesota here. How many more? Karen and Craig? Very good. Well, I went to Minnesota, and Minnesota healed me. 100% healed me. It was just amazing what happened there. Going back a little bit, in 1832, there had been the Black Hawk Indian Wars in that area, and in Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. And the treaty then, in 1832, said that no white man would ever venture more than 50 miles west of the Mississippi River. And the idea that was, at that time, was why would any white man want to go more than 50 miles west of the Mississippi River? But they did. And of course, they kept moving into Minnesota further and further. So they asked me to go to La Crescent, Minnesota, and take care of the area around there. Well, the Presbyterian Church was thinking at that time that I would take care of an area maybe 6 to 8 miles away, where I could easily get there on horseback and back in the same day. But I took it to mean as far as I could go. And so, being as healthy as I was then, I started traveling farther and farther out from my central location in La Crescent. And I got so that I could get out 100, 200, and 300 miles away. And I got so that I could preach in La Crescent on Sunday night, and then the next morning I could ride 25 to 30 miles and preach again on Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, and I could get back home. And then it got to the point where I was going farther and farther, and I wasn't getting home at night. Mary wrote to one of her friends, and she said, it gets a little lonesome because Sheldon is gone a lot. That's the last time that she ever said anything about that, because evidently she got used to it because I was gone all the time. I was gone all the time. We had a good time there in Minnesota, though, and I built up that area and built churches there, and then I started looking toward the west and the south, and I asked the mission field if I could go into Iowa. So we went into Iowa and we worked in the Iowa area. So I was in that mission field for about 10 years. I had a meeting in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and where several pastors were there, and 2 other pastors and myself went up to Prospect Hill, which is on the bluffs of Council Bluffs. And we looked off to the west and discussed the fact that there was not one Presbyterian church between where we were standing and the West Coast. And on the West Coast, there were only 6 in California and 3 in Oregon. And there were virtually no Protestant churches anywhere there. In fact, the Catholic churches were basically the only ones that there was for the Indian missions. And so we started talking about that, and I started getting the desire to go farther and farther west. I got a hold of the mission field again, or the mission association, and asked them if I could go farther west. So they finally allowed me, after much deliberation, they finally allowed me to go into Nebraska, Wyoming, the Dakotas, and Montana. Well, there are a few difficulties with that. Number one, communication was a problem, because I don't know how many Presbyterians there are here, but we're Presbyterian, and the Presbyterians do everything by committee. And it ain't necessarily the most efficient way to do it, especially when you're talking about being so far away from that committee. The committees had trouble to get together in those days, and when they did, they had trouble making a decision, and when they did, they had trouble communicating with anybody that was very far in the field. So a lot of the decisions that were made, I just kind of made on the sly and got those things done. They gave me a salary of $1,500 a year. That is, they said that they were going to send me $1,500 a year. Generally, it came more to the tune of $150 to $300. But that did not include any transportation. So, trying to get to Montana from western Iowa was not an easy situation, and it was very costly. So, finances was a problem with the Presbyterian Church, and so what I had to do, I had to go back east to where my family was, to all of their friends, and beg for money, trying to get the stuff done that I wanted to do. And so I kept running to Montana and to Wyoming and the Dakotas, and then in 1870, I first stepped foot in Colorado. Now here again, the Presbyterian Church was going to tell me what to do in Colorado. And when I got the communication of exactly where I was supposed to go, I had already been there. In the first 10 days that I stepped foot in Colorado, I established 4 churches in 10 days. And each one of them had in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 members. I would find people and we'd establish a church and make arrangements to start building one. And, but in those first 10 days, I started churches in Pueblo, in Colorado City, or Colorado Springs at that time, Georgetown and Idaho Springs, and I did it all on horseback and stagecoach. And so you can imagine how much traveling I was doing. But from there on, I worked through Colorado and got into Park County. So I worked out the area, and there were a lot of other ministers who maybe some of you have heard of John Dyer, and I have heard of him. But anyway, John Dyer had gone in, but the difference in the emphasis was his emphasis was to go to each one of the camps and to preach. Where my emphasis was to do that, but in the process, start a church. Because I felt there had to be a central place for someone to come. And so that's where I started. I got to Fairplay in 1872, and I found 8 people there who were attuned to becoming church members. And so we started the church in Fairplay in 1872. The first preacher that I had there was a guy by the name of Dallas Finks. And the way I did it, I went back east and I'd go to the seminaries and I would talk about how great the West was. And everyone is moving west. And your sons and daughters are coming west. And this is the exciting and wonderful place to be. And I didn't exactly tell them all the hardships that they might incur while they were there. But Dallas Finks was right out of seminary, and he had married Mrs. Finks just prior to coming out here. And just after he came here, he wrote me a letter. And I'll read a part of that letter just so you get an idea. Dallas Finks says, "I was accustomed to conservative Eastern society, where to be respectable, one must show some regard for the church and the Sabbath school and the ministry, and where set ways and deep-worn ruts kept everything religious running in a precise course. Imagine then, if you can, my first impression of my field of labor, Fairplay, when on Sunday I walked through the streets to find the stores open and doing a rousing business, the streets filled with men of all kinds and colors, with prairie schooners and trains of freighters, with the air full of oaths, with the crack of the blacksnake whip, with the ring of the anvil in one hand and the sound of the saw and the hammer on the other, mingled with shouts and the carousing of drunken men and the music of the dance hall. Either they are out of touch with me, or I'm out of touch with them." It gives you a little bit of a picture of what Fairplay was like in 1873. Later on, 1873, they did not build a church in 1873, by the way. That church that you see on the brochure there was built in 1874, which might have been a good idea because in 1873, most of Fairplay burned down. There was tremendous fire that burned almost the whole town. And Dallas Finks wrote me another letter. And he said, I have a contrite heart because I am responsible for the fire that burned most of Fairplay.
Oh, no.
Because I prayed for the people of Fairplay to get out of the saloons and into the church or suffer the consequences. So he felt that he was responsible for that fire. But later on, then in 1874, on May 6th of 1874, that little congregation applied to the Board of Missions to build a church. And they asked for $1,200 to build that church. $200 of it coming from the congregation itself, from the membership. And in October of that year, that church was dedicated. And everybody said, how in the world can you do that? Number one, all of the log mills, all of the lumber mills in this whole area was dedicated to one thing, and that's to serving the mines for the shores. And all the lumber was rough-sawn lumber. They didn't have all of the nice lumber that goes on the side of a building, all of the milled lumber. So what I did is I went to St. Louis and met with a guy who was from Chicago, a guy by the name, the company by the name of Lyman Bridges. And what they were doing is selling prefab houses. They were selling houses and moving them by rail to wherever they needed to be. And so I convinced them that they ought to build churches. And I gave them the specifications and they said they could do that. And so that little church came from Chicago by rail, and it was put up in just a few months. Some of the other denominations were saying, how in the world is Jackson doing that? You know, how is he coming in and building a church off the bat and doing it that fast? And that's how, because they were prefab churches. There were a lot of those churches exactly like that was built in this area. Since then, however, a lot of these towns have either grown and they tore down the churches and built larger ones, or the town went defunct because a lot of these were built in the mining towns where the mines played out and everybody left. And so the church was not needed anymore. This is the only church that I know of that's still standing. But those churches did the job at that time. It was difficult getting people because people were coming and going with all the mines closing, and then but in Fairplay it was such that the mines stayed long enough to build up the population there, and then it became a county seat, and then, you know, the population just kind of hung in there. That church was scheduled to be torn down in 1943, by the way, and then, or in 1941, and the war happened and it was delayed, and we're thankful to this day that that happened. At any rate, getting back to 1874, the church was put up, and the bell in the tower was put up and dedicated in 1875. I don't feel that there should ever be a church anywhere that doesn't have a bell, because you need a way to bring the people to church. That bell and that church served many purposes, because the church or the school wasn't built yet, so that bell became the call for the children to come to school. It also became the fire bell if there was a fire in town, and so it was used for a lot of things. In Colorado, I built a lot of churches. In the western U.S., I started and built over 100 churches. And so I found that I was quite a convincer. And what I would do is I went to the railroad, because the railroads were just coming into being then. And I went to the stagecoach companies and I said, look, I'm going to bring good people here. I'm going to build churches, and I'm going to bring good folks, and they're going to build businesses, and that's going to make your stagecoach line more valuable than it is now. And or the railroad that did the same thing. So I got free passes. So now I could travel, and I could travel at a far less expense. And by the way, it really helped being 5'2" when the stagecoach seat is 4'6". Because at least you can kind of stretch out and sleep. There was one time when I went from Utah to Montana that it was a 7-day trip, 24 hours a day. And the only time we stopped was to change horses, and usually one meal a day, and the meals were terrible. And but I was able to do it, and I was able to do it maybe because I was, just over 5 foot tall. But anyway, a couple of things that happened while I was in Colorado. One is that I wanted to show those people, those Eastern Presbyterians, what it was like out here. I kept telling them, and they were believing me, but they're starting to not so sure about how much money they were going to send my way to fund some of my schemes. And so I asked for some of the Presbyterians to come out and see. So they came by rail into Denver, and I wrangled them a free pass. They got here, and there was a couple, and I said, these were friends of mine. I said, I want to show you something. So I hired a buggy, and with a team of horses, and I loaded the two of them up, and we went to Georgetown. And I went up this trail, I went to a lake that was up high. A beautiful, beautiful area. And I just wanted to share this with them. Well, the road was quite narrow, and it was quite steep, but the horses were doing a good job. But Mrs. Kendall wasn't doing such a good job. She was scared to death. And Dr. Kendall was holding her, but we made it to the top, and we did fine, and I showed them this wonderful, beautiful view, and then we got ready to come down. And Mrs. Kendall said, I think I'll walk. And Dr. Kendall said, okay, and he got out and he walked with Mrs. Kendall. And I'm on the buggy all by myself, coming down, and I'm going very, very slow, and everything was going along fine. It's a very, very narrow road. It's just hardly any wider than the buggy itself. And all of a sudden, something spooked the inside horse. I don't know what it was, but something spooked the inside horse, who jumped sideways, knocked the outside horse over the bank, and down the side of the mountain towards the river. And I bailed off just in time. And oddly enough, we went down there, and I was able to cut one of the horses out of the harness. The other one had been in the river and ended up downstream. And other than a few scratches, the horses were okay. The buggy was firewood, but so anyway, that's the kind of thing happened. One of the other things that happened to me is I was west of Pueblo, camping out, and I had been told that a stagecoach was coming through about midnight. So I camped out in the sagebrush right near the road. And when it came close to being midnight, I got my camp all together, I lit my lantern and got out in the middle of the road and started swinging the lantern when I heard the stagecoach coming. Well, a couple things. Number one, the stagecoach driver did not know there was going to be a dumb preacher out in the middle of the road swinging a lantern in the middle of the night trying to stop the stagecoach. He didn't know that. What I didn't know is that inside the stagecoach was the sheriff and 4 deputies, and they were trying to bring a desperado into Kansas City to the prison, and they had been told that they were going to be held up, and the desperado was going to be rescued from that stagecoach. And so when I got to the stagecoach door, it popped open, and here's 5 cocked pistols pointed at my head. Nobody sneezed, and I made it okay. But it was one of those times when you wonder if you're going to meet your maker faster than normal. But those are the kind of things that happened. There were 5 times when the stagecoach was held up, just before or just after I was aboard. And so I was lucky in that respect. There were 3 times when my death was announced, and that was premature too. That didn't happen. But at any rate, I loved Colorado and kept moving west. And I went into New Mexico and Arizona and Utah. And the Mormons didn't particularly like me in Utah, but I did that anyway. And there were a lot of herring experiences. In moving west, once I was going to go to Idaho, and I got ready I was halfway there, and I was stopped on the trail, and I was told that I could not go into Idaho because Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce were on a rampage there, and it wasn't safe to be in Idaho. So I went around Idaho and went to Portland, Oregon. I had a wonderful friend, Reverend McFarland, who'd worked with me in New Mexico. And Reverend McFarland and Mrs. McFarland were close friends of mine. And Reverend McFarland had died. And so I wanted to express my condolences to Mrs. McFarland. So after I had a meeting with another group of Presbyterian people there in Princeton, I went on to visit Mrs. McFarland. She wanted to know what I was going to do from there. And I said, well, you know, I've always wanted to go to Alaska. And the Presbyterian board back, they didn't know where I was anyway. So I decided to go to Alaska. And Mrs. McFarland said, you know, I think it would be good for me to do some traveling. Can I go with you to Alaska? I've always wanted to go to Alaska. So I said, sure. So Mrs. McFarland joined my entourage, and we headed for Alaska.